Hello, folks. We want to give you a little bit of a walkthrough for your Mod 6. And in fact, if it's not too cute here, we're going to call this video a demo for your memo, okay? So your job, you read the memo assignment, but basically, okay, in broad terms, you're going to be telling us where you think the U.S. economy is going in this year and why. And we're going to want some numbers, but we also want a reasoned narrative. We want to know the why. Okay, now the optional tool that we're using, it's a small model, it's simplified, but it kind of captures the flavor of actually the kinds of models that macroeconomists, let's say at the Fed or market forecaster, may actually be using these days. The reason why we'd want to do that is because a simultaneous model captures everything at once, okay? That is the job of the model, and your job is to explain the assumptions and the results of the model. Okay, so you've seen much of it already. It's going to have an IS curve, goods and services. They will have an interest rate rule. We'll call that the real Taylor rule, and we've already discussed and given you some materials where we're arguing that it's really just an extension. It's kind of like a little twist on the LM curve, and most people get that, but we have some materials if you need some extra backup on that. We factored in inflation, so now we're looking at the real interest rate, which is the nominal interest rate minus inflation, and that means we have to have a Phillips curve, what we call a modern Phillips curve, which is the short-run aggregate supply curve, and that's the inflation function. Inflation is a function of the output gap and other factors. Okay, so now if you wanted to have some extra reading, I especially would like you to have a look at some of the extra stuff that MemoT2 has, for example, on the Taylor rule, page 445, 447, and also what we call the Taylor principle, 467, 471. I also have this featured prominently in my chapter 11. Okay, and there is a video just to remind you the LM to RT. Okay, how the two ideas correspond to one another, but they're pretty similar. And the same thing, the idea that a modern Phillips curve is basically a short-run aggregate supply curve. MemoT2 has a box on page 420, but also we have some video material. And also, if you really want to get a little deeper into it, to have a look at my chapter 10, okay? So in your hypothetical demo, we're going to be looking at a hypothetical country, Fredonia 2018. You'll be looking at the US. Okay, the work group, we're thinking of like a hypothetical group. We'll call them Fredonia Macro Associates. Okay, but this is your F&M group. You're going to be looking at they'll be looking at the likely shocks for Fredonia, the events and disturbances that may take place, and you'll be doing the same thing. We're going to be looking at what the model says for Fredonia. You'll be looking at the United States. The only difference here is that we're not giving you a write-up for Fredonia, but for the United States, that's your job. You need to give us an interesting and well-reasoned narrative, okay? Now, there's something that's new here in the model. It's called a country data dashboard. There are two parts. There's the main data, and then there's some background data. You'll notice the main data has sort of the main stuff you'd want. Observed GDP growth relative to the previous year. I have to stress that, okay, we have a previous year. We have a baseline or sort of a vanilla no shock scenario here that you'll be starting off with in this column. This column here, we'll call it Alt 1, this is going to be the main scenario, in our case for Fredonia Macro Associates. This will be where you'll put in your main scenario here, and we'll do that in just a second. But then there may be some uncertainty or some disagreement. You might want to put sort of an optional, well, this may happen too, and we'll show you how we do that over here in this column. But the main data is the observed GDP, the GDP growth, unemployment rate, and the CPI, and the interest rates. We're going to be looking at the bank lending rate, and this is the equivalent of the prime lending rate in the United States, and you see we have some numbers here. But then there's some other interesting numbers. For example, the output gap, we've talked about that, the civilian labor force, full employment, the employment rate, which is just 1 minus the unemployment rate, and then here's the central bank interest rate right here. Okay, and we're assuming that the short run interest rate, which is the in this case in the United States it would be the Fed funds rate, is somewhat lower than the bank lending rate, and there's a spread of about 3%. Okay, so Fredonia Macro Associates have said, well, look, the government may have to tighten its belt. There may be some austerity. That would mean a downward shift in demand. Workers also are demanding more wages, and that's going to be a higher inflationary expectations. And then finally, some in the Fredonia Macro Associates have a view on the new central bank president. That this person is even more of an inflation hawk than the previous one, which means what? That they expect actually some discretionary, some extra tightening of interest rates. So let's see how this plays out in Fredonia. We're going to go to the dashboard here. Okay, so you can see here, we don't show everything, but I think we show enough here. So here we have the previous year for Fredonia, and then we have the baseline. Okay, so what did we say? First of all, we said that in the view of Fredonia Macro Associates, there was going to be some austerity, that they were going to have to cut back. So that's a -1, let's put. Okay, you're going to be choosing your number. Okay, so less demand. And you can see already that we're going to have a leftward shift of the demand curve, the IS curve, I should say, and also a leftward movement along the Phillips curve. It's lower aggregate demand, and that's going to mean you can take a look in terms of the output gap. The output gap under the baseline was 0, but actually now we're going into recession, so this is already causing some recession here. On top of that, people are a little bit worried about this extra wage push, and this may be boosting inflation up to, let's say, 3%. Okay, now, why does this? Okay, you can see down here in the Phillips curve, this extra inflation is going to mean an upward shift of the Phillips curve. Why? Because the modern Phillips curve is an expectations augmented Phillips curve that includes both expected inflation plus the output gap. And you can see that even though the output gap is negative, there's going to be higher, for any level of the output gap, we'll have higher inflation that's going to be passed on to consumers. So you can see here now that in terms of your output, you're going to be, okay, under the baseline, we had been forecasting 4.9, but Fredonia Macro Associates are telling us, look, really the growth could be much lower. Okay, the unemployment rate boosted up to about 5.3 instead of 5, and the inflation rate, well, actually the inflation rate is coming up as well. Why? Because of these wage demands. So Fredonia Macro Associates is a little bit pessimistic about what's going on relative to sort of a baseline scenario. Now then, as I mentioned, okay, there are maybe some amongst the Fredonia Macro Associates people, there's actually some disagreement. So you can see that there's one of the members of Fredonia Macro Associates thinks, well, look, okay, how is the central bank president going to respond to all of this? Is he just going to stand by and just kind of like go with this tailor? No, in fact, there may be some extra adjustment. We're going to put this in here. You'll notice that here we have the same 3% shock here in an alternative scenario. We have the same demand shock here, the -1, but in addition to that, we're going to put 1.5, and I think we have to put a 1.5%, and you're going to see that's going to mean higher interest rates, and you're going to see here that's going to be even lower inflation. So interestingly, the central bank president will have successfully brought down the growth rate even more and the inflation rate a little bit even more, but at the expense of a little bit higher unemployment. So the bottom line for this column is that if the central bank the president is as sort of tough on inflation as one member of the FMA team thinks they would be, and that's of course a big question, they're going to have an even worse scenario. They're going to, in terms of output, a little bit better inflation, but higher unemployment. And you can see also the interest rates that are presumed down here. Okay, so let's wrap up here. We've just shown you a hypothetical demo for Fredonia. Your assignment is to basically do the same thing. We're going to give you data for the United States, and then you're going to be using the same thing, but in addition, we want you to give a nice, interesting narrative. That's the heart and soul. That's the core of your memo assignment. Thank you very much.